Chapter 18. I think we can cover 18 today. I don't know that we'll get into 19, but let's start on chapter 18. We talked last week, Jewish men had to be at least 20 years old before they could go to war. And that goes all the way back to Numbers chapter 1, verse 3. So we think that David is somewhere around 18 years old about this time. He is made a high-ranking officer in Saul's army, chapter 18, verse 5. So he's gone from a kind of a part-time armor bearer after playing the lyre for King Saul and giving him some comfort. He's going all the way from an armor bearer where he kind of split his time. He's part-time. Sometimes he was a shepherd taking care of Jesse's sheep. Sometimes he's in service to Saul. But whatever he did, especially some successful military missions, Saul made him a high-ranking officer at an early age. Something to note, from this point on, David found himself in life-threatening situations, conflict with Saul. And Wearsby made a good comment. David did not create Saul's problems. He just helped reveal Saul's problem. David, humble, courageous, honest, faithful, whereas Saul, deceitful, scheming, jealous, and that's just the ones that we're going to look at today. Saul had lots of problems. David was successful. He continued to lead Saul's army into victory, whereas, Sharon, I just love your word. Saul was paranoid. He was trying to protect his kingdom. And you would think that these victories that Saul's army was having, you'd think these victories would bring David and Saul together. Well, due to Saul's jealousy, scheming, and deceitfulness, they just drove David and Saul apart. Specifically, chapter 18. Saul loved David. He had had an affinity for him up until this point in time. Remember, he liked him very much. We looked at that back in 16:2. But as we said, that changes very, very quickly to jealousy and hatred. I want to skip ahead just a little bit in chapter 18, then we'll come back to these. But let's verse 12, 18:12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. 18:14, just a few verses later. In everything he did, everything David did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. 18 verses 28, verses 29. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. So what's the secret to Saul's success? The Lord was with him. The Lord is going to be with his people. The Lord is going to be with his people. And because of this, and because the Lord was with David, even though David was going to be a fugitive for 10 years, Saul was never able to harm him. He chased him, hunted him down for 10 years, but Saul was never able to harm him. Tried over and over again, used all kinds of schemes, all kinds of plans to kill him, but he was never able to harm him. Saul was guarding his throne with paranoid, and David was being prepared to accept the throne. Let's look a little bit. We're going to back up and kind of start at the front of the chapter. Let's look at David and Jonathan, because Warren Wearsby in his commentary kind of threw me for a curve. And the reason that I really have appreciated Warren Wiersbe for so many years is that he really digs very deep into the history, and he is very biblically accurate, historically, biblically. But he kind of threw me for a curve today because, and maybe us for a curve today. You know, we typically think, or I typically thought of, after all of these years, looking at these stories over and over again, that David and Jonathan were just two frolicsome, and that's the word that Wiersbe uses, two frolicsome teenagers who just liked each other. But Wiersbe, when he looked a little bit deeper, according to some biblical chronologists, they're at least 25 to 28 years difference in ages. Jonathan is 25 to 28 years older than David. There's a pretty significant age, and the reasoning that he used, that Wiersbe used, had to be 20 years old before you could be a part of the army. Jonathan was already commanding about a third of Saul's army. We go back to 1 Samuel 13. Saul reduced Israel's army down to 3,000. And remember, 2,000 went with Saul and 1,000 went with David. So he was already pretty inactive, or Jonathan was in active service. And he had already won at least 2 victories. The Philistine outpost at Gilboa, and that's who, you remember, Saul took the credit for. And his armor bearer, he and his armor bearer had defeated the Philistines at Michmash. So according to Wiersbe, Jonathan was more of a seasoned soldier than an inexperienced, immature adolescent. I dug into this a little bit. Is that the first time y'all had ever heard that? That is the first time I had ever, and I think by the expression that I seen on some of your faces, and I didn't ever find a year, 25 to 28 years, but a lot of good sound biblical data that I found said that Jonathan was older, much older than David. Kind of supported what if y'all find something different, let me know, because that kind of just, as I said, threw me for a curve right off the bat, because I had always kind of pictured them as two young, energetic, frolicsome teenagers. And so I guess my question is, how do you think, what do you think drew David to Jonathan? Because Jonathan just liked him immediately. What do you think, from what you know of David's personality, what do you think Jonathan saw that just made them bond so quickly, that made them hit it off so quickly? We're going to see in chapter 18:1, Jonathan became one in spirit. He loved him as himself. I liked what one commentary said. The soul of Jonathan was knit together with the soul of David. So what did Jonathan see in David?
I think that Jonathan saw David's love for the Lord. And I think Jonathan's heart was found too.
So there was those two souls being knitted together. Tippy, might be a good way to just the love for the Lord, that common bond that they had for the Lord. Yeah, I think that Jonathan could see that the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him in what he did. What else do you think brought them together?
He saw how Saul treated David. And I think he had sympathy for David. He knew what his father was like.
Yeah, and Francis said just the way that maybe Jonathan saw that Saul treated David kind of made him you know, I've been involved in hiring a few people, and would hire these young guys, and it wouldn't take long for me to say, wow, that's a good thing. You know, you could always tell when it doesn't take long sometimes. You can always tell maybe right off the bat that this is a good person. This is a good work ethic, a good, strong, courageous, brave, faithful, all of those. I think David put himself in a position where all that Jonathan had to do was just open his eyes and recognize some very outstanding attributes that he had.
With that in mind, Jared Manna has been interviewing. He's completed his doctorate and is ready to preach. And it looks like that he will go to a congregation in Kentucky.
Wow.
They were hoping Arkansas. But apparently the Lord said no.
Well, like father, like son, and that's exciting for Jared because we've been privy to hear Jared speak here, and you can just kind of tell he's got some good things going for him. He's got some excellent things going for him. Excited about that. Maybe not back in Arkansas where they want it to be, but maybe Kentucky's a little bit closer than Texas. So Wiersbe makes another comment. He said, Jonathan and David had a kind of manly affection that comrades in arms have. One of the things that brought them together is they were both soldiers, both fighting sometimes side by side, both in Saul's army, both the same enemy, the Philistines. Well, over the next several chapters, including today, we're gonna continue to see a lot of things in Jonathan and David that drew them together, that brought them together. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Well, verse 2, chapter 18, verse 2, David became a permanent part of Saul's army and soon to be a permanent part of Saul's family. Remember, when David killed Goliath, Saul had said, whoever kills Goliath is going to get one of my daughters in marriage. Verse 3 talks about a covenant. I found a commentary that said this is a little bit more than just an agreement. This was a brotherhood covenant frequently used in the Eastern culture, where you actually went through a ceremony where two men went through a ceremony, a brotherhood ceremony that had to have witnesses. These two men were sworn brothers for life. So this covenant is talking about more so about this bond, this formal ceremony that they went to become brothers for life. And then verse 4, chapter 18, verse 4, Jonathan took off his robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, was destined for the throne of Israel. Again, by Eastern culture, when an heir, and that's what Jonathan was, he was heir to the throne. Whenever someone gave you part of their dress, like Jonathan took his cloak off, Jonathan took his tunic off. When someone gave you something that they were wearing, this was a way to place, give very high honor to that person. So that's what Jonathan was doing for David. Bonding that friendship, a brotherhood for life. You're a special friend. I'm going to give you my cloak. I'm going to give you my undergarment, what's the tunic, what he wore under the cloak. But there was something additional, because Jonathan also gave him what? His weapons. His weapons. So he gave him his clothes, and then he gave him his weapons. And that was more of a concession. What Jonathan is telling to David, I know that one day you're going to take my place and you're going to rule Israel. By giving him his clothes, his cloak, his robe, the tunic, plus his weapons, that's a concession, saying, I know, even though I'm the heir right now. Now, Wiersbe speculates that David must have said something to him already about the fact that he had been anointed. We don't see this in Scripture. So that's just kind of a premise that Wiersbe takes. Well, David, Saul saw David as a threat, as an enemy. Jonathan looked at David a little bit different. Wiersbe makes a comment. He says, but when a leader nurtures himself on pride, jealousy, and fear, he suspects everyone. Anybody that's looking with pride, jealousy, and fear, remember what he said before? He was a suspicious man. Ron?
I'm just thinking, we don't know a lot about Jonathan's personality. He may not have wanted to be king. How many children don't follow their father into a particular profession?
Ron's comment was we don't have all the backstory on Jonathan. And Ron, you're just exactly right. My NIV usually does a pretty good job of explaining different, as you go through different personalities, that there wasn't a whole lot they had to say about Jonathan, even as I kind of read through his bio that's in my Bible. So he might not have wanted anything to do with, and kind of based on the way that Saul had been behaving, he might not have wanted anything to do with being a king. So he might have welcomed David taking on that obligation. Again, that's just a premise. We're not for sure.
But had God already told Saul that he wasn't going to be, his family wasn't going to be king?
Yeah, Saul's not only Saul himself, but his whole legacy, and you might be right. You know, Jonathan could have been present. He might have passed that along to an excellent point. Yeah, he had already, in fact, God said, you're going to have the kingdom torn away from you. So, and that's an excellent point. Might have already been kind of had the stage set.
Kind of get, might be in there somewhere that Jonathan thought he might become David's right hand when he became king.
And it says that specifically, just a few chapters, that he identifies Saul when it's kind of, when David's kingship is kind of made more public. The first one that he chooses to be his second in command is Jonathan. That's a pretty tight bond. That's a pretty tight brotherhood. Again, verse 5, David is rewarded for his military success. He's given this high rank. And then the Jewish people recognize and praise him publicly. After his God-given success, after the death of Goliath, after the defeat of the Philistine army, let's read chapter 18, verse 6 and 7. The women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul, and singing and dancing and joyful songs with timbrels, and those are tambourines, and lyres, and they danced, they sang. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul has slain his thousands, but David has his tens of thousands. Proverbs 27:21. The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but people are tested by their praise. The crucible for silver, the furnace for gold, but people are tested by their praise. How do you guys handle praise? How do you guys typically handle praise? Do you consider it a test? If we look at Proverbs, do you consider that a test, a kind of a refining, if you will? And that's what the crucible and the furnace, those were all things that metals went to refine them to do what? To make them
Harder.
yeah, harder, more pure, more tested, kind of tested with fire. Thought being, if you pass the praise test, then God's going to give you more. He's going to give you new responsibilities in the kingdom. Where's makes the comments? If praise humbles us, then God can use us. But if praise puffs you up, we're not ready for the promotion. Because that's typically how most people handle praise. They either kind of get a little puffed up and prideful, or it really drives them to more humility. I love Dale Manning for a lot of reasons, but you come up, and he's done this time after time with me. Boy, Dale, I enjoyed your sermon. What does he do? What does he do? God gets the credit. God gets the credit. Well, seems as if David passed the test, but Saul didn't do quite as well. He didn't like David getting the praise. In fact, verse 8, chapter 18, verse 8, Saul was angry, displeased greatly. I was looking at a version this morning. It said that it galled at him. All the praise that David was getting, it galled at him. Saul asked, what more can he get but the kingdom? Again, remember, Saul has just had the kingdom torn away from him. Chapter 15, verse 28. Wiersbe kind of sums that up in a word. He says it's envy. Saul's problem was envy. He says envy is dangerous and an insidious enemy, a cancer that slowly eats out our inner life and leads us to say and do terrible things. Envy is our enemy. Envy is not good for us. Proverbs 14:30. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Just a couple of comments. Envy is an internal pain we get when others receive something that we think we should have got. It's the sin of successful people who can't stand to see others succeed. Dr. Bob Cook, I'm not for sure who he is, but Dr. Wiersbe references him. He says, Dr. Cook says, everybody wears a sign that reads, please make me feel important. Everybody wears that sign. We like praise, don't we? We like. So it's not the fact that we get it, it's how do we handle it? Does it make us prideful? Does it make us puffed up? Does it make us humble? Envious people want the praise, but they can't handle it. And they don't like it when someone else gets it. It quickly turns to something that rots their bones. I love this comment by Wiersbe. Envious people max out their credit cards to buy something they don't need just to impress people who don't really care.
And they get to pay interest.
And they get to pay interest. And they get, we do things to impress people when the reality is they could care less. I've had to think through that one a little bit. That's a good antidote for life. Envy easily leads to anger, and anger is often the first step toward murder. Jesus talked about this in Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5:21-26. Sermon on the Mount is the sermon that should have changed everything. The Sermon on the Mount is the sermon that should have changed everything. Verses 21 and 22. You have heard it said to the people of long ago, you shall not murder. 10 commandments. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. That kind of changes the way we look at getting angry. Anger condemned. Chapter 18, verse 9. And from this point on, Saul kept an eye on David. Saul kept an eye on David. Things were never again, from this point, they were never again the same for Saul and David, as far as Saul was concerned. Verse 10, chapter 18, verse 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul is not in a good place. He's being tormented again by this evil spirit that we talked about back in chapter 16, verse 14. And we think that that was discipline, that God, because this spirit is from God, that it was discipline due to Saul's disobedience and rebellion. So Saul is envious, he's angry, depressed, and David is playing the lyre, trying to calm him down. The thought about verse 10, thought about prophesying. Does your footnotes say anything about what this prophecy was, what this prophesying? I looked into this a little bit, and it's not that what I could find, it's not so much for telling the future. It's more of that he was under the influence, that Saul was under the influence of this evil spirit. So he's not out there prophesying as in predicting the future. It's more so that he is just engulfed with this evil spirit that came forcibly upon him.
But he sees David as a threat, and he's jealous of David, basically, what it is. He's letting it, seep within his mind that David is better than him. He doesn't like that. That's why he throws the spear at him.
I think he is just not in a good place, is he? He is pretty, he's let himself get pretty emotionally, mentally beat up. Where he says to himself, I'm going to pin him to the wall. Of course, we know this is just an attempted plot because David eluded him twice. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because, again, the Lord was with David, but he departed from Saul. I'm sorry, Ed.
Oh, I'm just gonna say, what about the evil spirit that God put on him? Because it doesn't say that Saul got mad. Of course he did, but then God sends an evil spirit upon him to make him do this stuff. I'm just wondering, does God sometimes fool with us that way if we have stubbornly resisted him and done things that offend him? Could he send an evil spirit upon us today? In other words,
He's trying to teach Saul what's going on. And Saul isn't taking it the right way.
He's not picking up on it, is he?
Yeah,
Is he?
he's not picking up on it either. I mean,
it says,
he sees him with anger, he sees him with confusion. He doesn't want to admit that the kingdom has been taken away from him, even though he's told it in the past, the kingdom was taken away from him. And that cease within you, that he's recognizing David as the one that's going to take over. And he's very jealous of that. And I think that's the evil spirit bringing that forward into his conscience, you know, when this guy's gonna take over, I don't like this guy, he's gonna take my place, I'm gonna kill him. That basically is what it is, what happened.
And all of those negative thoughts, and Ed, I'm gonna get back and kind of try to address your question. I don't know that I'm gonna answer it. I'll try to address it. Is all of that tormented David? And remember back in 16:14, God gave him an evil spirit to torment him.
So.
So,
I'm sorry, Saul. I got into that about 2 weeks ago. I thought I'd gotten over that. But Saul was the one with the problem. Saul was the one being tormented. Saul was the one being disciplined. And Ed, where does it say? Is it Hebrews that God disciplines those he loves? So could that happen? Ed, I gotta say, yeah. I got to say, because God loves us, and we think that Saul is going through some kind of discipline.
He's trying to get Saul to recognize what's going on, and Saul's ignoring the lesson and seething anger. I mean, he's fully embraced the anger, and he's not thinking of what making him angry, why he's angry. He's thinking more along the lines, he's going to take over. I don't want him to take over, and I want to, you know, to prevent it. Instead of, why am I getting so angry? Why are these things happening? You know, and thinking back to what was told him whenever he did do what God said. Really, that's what it all boils down to. He doesn't want to admit that God would take that key away from him, even though he's told. God took the key away from him.
I think you're exactly right, because I think it was back in chapter 16 when the spirit was given to David, it was taken away from Saul, God's spirit. And so that's when he got the evil spirit that tormented him. And David just, my next comment is that Saul must have known that he was fighting a losing battle.
It's just the way it's put. He sent an evil spirit to make Saul more jealous. So you say, whose fault is it? God's fault or Saul's fault? This is Saul's fault for both. But look at your system. Is that way of God's saying, only without hope?
No, it's just the way of the God says.
I'm going to take it away from you. I'm going to go at you. I'm sending the spirit that's going to do that. That's what God is. I think of God as merciful, kind, benevolent, and so on. But I think of him also. I mean, it's a fearful way of thinking about God. He can send a spirit upon us to totally destroy us. That was his intention. And God is right, whatever it does. I know he fights Satan all the time. And he fights us whenever we turn against him. But to be an enemy of God is a fearful thing.
Sometimes I don't know. I kind of struggle with that concept too, because I think God disciplines us to do what? To bring us back, to restore us, to bring us back to his love, to his grace, to his mercy.
It's both well we think of that, but what he sends on us, whether we will repent or not. I mean, think about it. If Saul really did think about what he did in the past, think about what led up to the key being taken away from him. could have repented, but instead he was jealous. He was all the negative emotions that you're not supposed to have. Saul felt, and that's what brought his downfall. It's his own force.
Just fighting that losing.
Yeah.
He's already, God's trying to get his attention and he's just kind of digging himself into a deeper hole. It is my way of kind of thinking.
Yeah.
I think he's still hoping he'll come back. I think, but also there's a point too, and boy, I can't.
But God knows exactly what you want to do before you do.
On the other hand, each of us can look at our own life and see where God has had direct intervention in an event.
And Duane, I think each one of us, to some extent or another, has probably felt God's discipline. And fortunately, it went the right way. It brought us back to God. It brought us, but Ed, there's also a point too where God gave them over. God gave them over to whatever the sin was in their life, that they refused to repent, that they refused God's discipline. And at some point in time, I think God gives them over, Ron.
I think probably David's presence, where Saul was, and gets everything back, they kind of a job and rims and Saul. In other words, there he is, and already is upset, and here he is, but that's the reason the girl was killed, because he was there. That was the focus of his anger. Sin. Before he couldn't have the evil spirit like the evil spirit on him, but like you could see something, striking back at God.
Ron, I think, and that's why Wiersbe's definition that envy will make you do things. Envy will make you say things that you wouldn't normally do. When you get so engulfed with that, in that tormented state of mind, depressed, evil spirits, envy will make you do things that you wouldn't even believe that you would do.